Some men reach their 70s and think the worst surprises are behind them. They've buried wives. They've watched companies fold. They've signed divorce papers and sat in empty houses and learned, slowly and painfully, that life doesn't owe you softness just because you've already taken your share of hard knocks. They think they've seen enough of the world to read it accurately. They think their instincts have been sharpened by decades of experience into something reliable. Alonzo Blackwell thought all of that. He was 74 years old, a retired executive from London, a man who had run departments, managed people, sat across negotiating tables from some of the most difficult personalities in British business. He thought he knew how to read a person. He was wrong. And this is what it cost him to find that out. The night she showed me her phone, I couldn't move. I just sat there in that restaurant in Makati with my hands flat on the table and my heart doing something I couldn't describe, not racing, not stopping, just shifting into a gear I didn't know it had. She was laughing. She was actually laughing, holding the screen toward me so I could see the messages, the ones she'd been sending to her friends for months. One of them said, "He is so easy, La. Old man doesn't question anything." Another said, "Almost done with him, planning to disappear after next transfer." She was reading them out loud, almost performing them, like she'd been waiting a long time to have this moment. And I sat there at 74 years old, a man who had once managed 300 people across 4 office locations, and I could not form a single word. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my ability to judge character, about what had happened between us over 6 months, all of it turned to dust in about 90 seconds. That was the night I lost more than 220,000 pounds. That was the night I lost the thing I thought no one could take from me after all these years. I lost my confidence in my own eyes. Let me go back to the beginning, because it didn't start with a phone screen in a restaurant. It started the way these things always start, quietly, ordinarily, with nothing that looked remotely like the disaster it was quietly becoming. I came to Manila for the first time 14 months ago, just after my 73rd birthday. My daughter Sophie had been on at me for 2 years to properly travel, not the work trips I'd spent 30 years confusing with seeing the world. She said I needed to stop sitting in the flat in Kensington reading financial reports I was no longer responsible for and actually go somewhere. She wasn't wrong. I'd retired 18 months before that trip, and I hadn't adjusted well. I'd spent my career being needed and useful and permanently in motion, and retirement had dropped me into a stillness that felt less like rest and more like being benched. My wife Margaret had passed 8 years prior, a stroke, fast and without warning, which is perhaps the most brutal way to lose someone because the shock of it never entirely fades even after the grief becomes manageable. Sophie was in Edinburgh with her husband and 2 young children. I had the flat, a cleaner who came Tuesdays, a wine club I barely participated in, and a great deal of time that had no shape to it. So I went to Manila, not because I had any particular draw to the Philippines. I'd never given it much thought, honestly. A friend from my corporate days, a fellow named Terrence who'd retired 5 years before me, had relocated to Cebu and sent me a message saying if I was going to do anything useful with my freedom, I should come out and see what the East looked like. I'm not sure I expected much. I expected heat and traffic and food I'd struggle with and 3 weeks that would at least count as having done something. What I found was a city that didn't care who I'd been. Manila doesn't care about your CV. It doesn't care that you once sat on a board or that your name appeared in the Financial Times. It moves at its own pace, and it's interested in different things than the things London is interested in. And for a man who'd spent his entire adult life being defined by professional status, that was unexpectedly a relief. I spent the first week with Terrence, who showed me around with the pride of a man who has found something genuinely good and wants to share it. We ate well. We walked. We sat in outdoor bars in the evenings and drank cold beer and watched the city do what it does, and I slept better in that first week than I had in 2 years. Terrence had a regular place he liked in the BGC area, a bar and restaurant that was mixed between expats and locals, the kind of establishment that doesn't make a fuss about anything, which suited me. We were there on a Thursday evening when I first saw Bella. She was working. That's the honest thing to say, and I should say it plainly. She was a bar hostess at that venue. Her job was to make guests feel welcome, to keep conversation going, to keep drinks being ordered. I knew this. I'm not going to pretend I didn't understand the commercial context. I'd been in enough client entertainment situations in my career to know what professional warmth looks like and what organic warmth looks like. I should have been able to tell the difference. She came to our table in the way that was her job, easy smile, fluid introduction, the kind of effortless attention that makes you feel as though you're the most interesting person in the room. Her name was Bella Navarro. She was 31 years old, she told me, from Makati originally, had been working at this venue for 2 years. She didn't push anything. That was the first thing that caught my attention. She wasn't pushy in the way I'd half expected from someone in her role. She asked me questions about London, about what I'd done there, about whether I found the heat difficult. When I answered, she listened. Actually listened, made follow-up points, remembered details from 5 minutes ago and looped them back into the conversation. I'm a man who spent his career in meetings with people who were performing listening while actually just waiting for their turn to speak. Bella felt different. She felt present. Terrence gave me a look when she moved to another table for a few minutes. He said, "She's good at her job, Alonzo." I told him I understood that. He said, "I mean, she's really good at her job." I said I'd heard him the first time. She came back to us before the evening ended and asked if I was staying in Manila long. I said 3 weeks, possibly more. She said if I came back, she'd be here. It was said simply, without calculation, or what appeared to be without calculation. I said I might do that. I went back 4 times in the first 2 weeks. Not every night, I'm not that kind of man, or I didn't think I was, but 4 times is 4 times, and by the 3rd visit Terrence had stopped coming with me. He didn't say much about it. He just said he had other things on, and I let him say that rather than have the conversation neither of us wanted to have. Bella and I began meeting outside the venue on her days off by the end of the 2nd week. Coffee first, then lunch. Then one afternoon we walked through a park near her neighborhood and she showed me a part of the city that had nothing to do with bars or expat areas and everything to do with how ordinary people in Manila actually lived. I found it genuinely interesting. She talked about her family, her mother, her younger brother who was studying, her complicated relationship with a father who'd left when she was young. She wasn't dramatizing it. She talked about it the way someone talks about something they've processed rather than something they're still bleeding from, which I took as a sign of emotional maturity. I liked her more after that afternoon than I had before it. By the end of my 3rd week, I had extended my stay. By the end of my 5th week, I had told Sophie I might be in the Philippines for a while longer than planned. Sophie asked if everything was all right. I said everything was fine, better than fine. She asked if I'd met someone. I paused long enough that she had her answer before I confirmed it. She didn't react with the alarm I half expected. She just said, "Be careful, Dad." I told her I was always careful. She said, "I know. I mean be careful in the other way." I dismissed what she meant and I shouldn't have. That's one of the things I've had to sit with. Bella and I settled into something that felt, from my side, entirely real. We spent large portions of each week together. She came to my serviced apartment in the Makati district and cooked for me Filipino food, which I had developed a genuine love for. The sour tamarind soups and the slow braised pork, and the simple fried rice she made at 2 in the afternoon like it was nothing. We watched films together. We talked. Not just pleasantries, actual conversations about the world, about history, about the difference between the way London operated and the way Manila operated. She was sharper than I'd initially registered. She had opinions and she expressed them without being aggressive about it, which I respected. I'd been married to a sharp woman and I knew what intelligence looked like in a person who didn't need to announce it. I was not naive about the financial dimension of things. I want to be honest about that. I understood that our circumstances were wildly different. I was a retired London executive with a pension and property and savings. She was a woman working in hospitality in a city where that income didn't stretch far. I understood that the imbalance existed and that it created a particular kind of dynamic. I chose, consciously, to be generous within that. I paid for everything when we were together: meals, outings, the small things. When she mentioned her brother's university fees were behind, I offered to help without being asked. £6,000. I thought of it as the kind of thing you do when you care about someone and you have the means. When her mother needed dental work that the public system wasn't providing quickly enough, I covered that too. £3,000. These weren't amounts that caused me distress. They were expressions of what I thought was a genuine relationship developing into something serious. Around the 3-month mark, Bella and I had a long conversation about the future. She asked me, carefully and without pressure, or what I experienced as without pressure, what I thought our relationship was. I said I thought it was something real and that I'd like to see where it went. She said she felt the same. She said she had never met a man who treated her as well as I did, who listened, who didn't make her feel like an object. I believed her. I believed every word of it. I've replayed that conversation many times since that night in the restaurant, and I still cannot find the seam in it. She was either telling the truth in that moment and changed entirely later, or she was lying with a completeness and a skill that I do not have the vocabulary to adequately describe. Around month 4, the amounts increased. Not dramatically, not in one jump, gradually, which I now understand was deliberate. Her landlord was increasing the rent, and she couldn't cover the difference, £12,000. Her brother's university situation was more complicated than she'd first described. The fees were higher. She was worried about him having to drop out £22,000. Her mother's health situation had escalated, and there was a specialist required that wasn't covered by any public provision, £18,000. She didn't ask for these things aggressively. She mentioned them the way someone mentions a worry to a person they trust in the course of ordinary conversation, not as a negotiation. And I, each time, found myself wanting to solve the problem, wanting to be the person who could. That want, the want to be useful, to be needed, to have a function in someone's life, that was the thing being targeted. I understand that now. At the time, I understood it as love. The first thing I noticed that I shouldn't have explained away happened around the end of month 4. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon and she didn't answer. Not unusual in itself, but she didn't call back until the following morning, and when she did, her explanation for the gap was thin. She'd been tired. She'd fallen asleep early. Her phone had been on silent. I said that was fine, but something in my chest registered it as not quite right, and I made a mental note. And then I talked myself out of the mental note because I didn't want to be the jealous old man who tracked someone's phone availability as a measure of affection. Then there was an evening she arrived at my apartment later than she'd said, by about 2 hours, and she smelled of a bar, not alcohol, but the particular smell of a venue, that mix of air conditioning and cigarette residue that clings to a person after an evening in a certain kind of place. She said she'd been with a friend. She named the friend. I didn't ask further because asking further felt like an accusation, and I didn't want to accuse her of anything I couldn't prove. That is one of the things I've examined most carefully in hindsight, the number of times I edited myself out of asking a reasonable question because asking felt worse than not knowing. That self-editing is not dignity. It is fear dressed up as dignity. There was a weekend, she said, she was visiting her mother in the province. I sent her a message on the Saturday afternoon that she didn't respond to until Sunday evening. When I mentioned it, she said the signal was poor in her mother's area, which is entirely plausible in many parts of the Philippines. I said, of course, no problem. But I lay awake for a portion of that Saturday night and I didn't sleep well, and in the morning I felt the particular shame of a man who has lain awake doubting someone he has decided to trust, and I folded the doubt up and put it somewhere it wouldn't be visible. Terence, who had been more absent from my days since Bella had entered them, had lunch with me in the 5th month at my insistence. He was his usual self, warm, direct, without drama. At the end of the meal, he asked, not unkindly, how things were going with Bella. I said very well. He asked how much I'd given her altogether. I told him a number that was honest but smaller than the real one, and even at that smaller number I watched him absorb it with the expression of a man choosing his next words very carefully. He said, "She's a professional, Alonzo. Her job is to make men feel the way you're feeling." I told him that what was between Bella and me had moved well beyond her professional context. He said he hoped I was right. He said it without sarcasm, and that made it worse, not better. I should have let that lunch change something. I didn't. I went back to the apartment, and Bella came over that evening and cooked, and we sat on the balcony, and she told me about a documentary she'd been watching about British history, specifically about the Tudor period, and she asked me questions about it that were intelligent and curious, and I answered them, and by the end of the evening Terrence's concern had been folded up and filed somewhere I wouldn't have to look at it. The amounts in month 5 were larger. She needed help with a family debt her mother had borrowed from a loan company with unfavorable terms, and the interest was compounding dangerously. £40,000. I sat with that figure longer than I'd sat with any of the others. I asked more questions than I usually allowed myself to ask. She answered all of them patiently, provided a document that showed the loan and the outstanding balance, showed me a message from her mother that detailed the situation. I sat with it for 3 days. Then I transferred the money. Then 2 weeks later, she said there was an additional fee that the document hadn't included a processing cost, another $7,000. I transferred that too. I told myself I had done due diligence. I had asked the questions. I had seen the paperwork. In reality, I had done just enough to satisfy the part of me that knew something was wrong while not doing nearly enough to actually find out what it was. By the 6-month mark, the total figure had reached £220,000. I hadn't added it up in those precise terms, another thing I've examined carefully, because adding it up would have produced a number that was impossible to look at and easy to explain away if broken into pieces. The monthly rent help, the university fees, the dental care, the mother's specialist, the family debt, the processing fee, the various smaller amounts that had accumulated between the larger ones. Individually, each had a story that made sense. Together, they told a different story that I chose not to read. The last transfer I made was for £45,000. This one was for a business opportunity, a small food supply operation that her uncle was establishing, that had a contract with a hotel chain that needed capital investment, that would generate returns that would allow Bella to leave the bar and do something more stable. I wanted that for her. I wanted her to have something better than the job she was doing because I believed she deserved better. I transferred £45,000 on a Monday. By the following Thursday, she had shown me her phone. We were at a restaurant in Makati, a place she'd suggested, which was slightly different from usual. She normally let me choose. I remember thinking at the time that she seemed different that evening, a quality of distraction, a slight distance that I couldn't put my finger on. I asked her if everything was all right. She said yes, fine, just tired. We ordered, we ate. And then, partway through the main course, she put her phone down on the table in front of me, screen facing up, already open to a message thread. She said, "I want you to see something." I looked at the screen. It was a conversation between Bella and someone named Rochelle. I read the most recent messages, first the ones at the top, and then I scrolled back, slowly, further and further into a thread that went back months. The messages were in English mixed with Tagalog, but enough was in English that I didn't need translation for the substance of it. He is so easy. Old man doesn't ask questions. Already got the property money, going for the business one next. Almost done, going to disappear after this. He thinks I love him, lol. There were laughing emojis. There were specific mentions of amounts. There was a message from 3 months earlier that said, "He keeps talking about his dead wife." I just nod and look sad. It's honestly exhausting. And there was Rochelle's response, "How much longer do you need?" And Bella's response, "One more big one, then I'm out." She had put the phone in front of me herself. That was the thing I couldn't make sense of immediately. She had chosen to do this. She wasn't discovered. She wasn't caught. She was showing me. There was a quality on her face that I can only describe as satisfaction. Not cruel in a theatrical sense. Something colder than cruelty, actually. She looked like a person who had been maintaining a performance for a long time and had finally, with great relief, stopped. She said, "I'm going to be honest with you, because I'm leaving tomorrow and there's nothing you can do about any of it." I said, and my voice was very quiet, quieter than I expected. "Why are you showing me this?" She said, "Because you've been asking me if things are real for months, and I always said yes, and now I don't need to anymore." I looked at her across the table, the woman who had cooked for me and watched documentaries with me and told me about her father and listened to me talk about Margaret and made me feel, for 6 months, like a person who still had a capacity for real human connection. I looked at her and I didn't recognize her. Not because she'd changed, because I was finally seeing what had been there the whole time. She said, "The money is gone. Don't bother with the police. It went through accounts that will be empty by morning." Then she picked up her phone, stood up, and left the restaurant. She didn't run. She walked out at a normal pace, and the door closed behind her, and I sat at that table alone with a half-eaten meal in front of me and 220,000 pounds less than I'd had that morning. I don't know how long I sat there. The waiter came to check on me at some point, and I must have communicated something because he brought water and stood at a respectful distance. Eventually, I paid the bill. I went back to the apartment. I sat in the chair by the window that looked out over Makati's lights, and I tried to think clearly, and I couldn't. What I felt in that chair was not anger. Anger came later. A clean and temporary anger that was almost a relief when it arrived. What I felt first was something closer to vertigo. The sensation of a man who has stepped through what he thought was solid ground and found nothing under his foot. I called Sophie that night. I think it was around 2 a.m. London time, which made it 9 or 10 in the evening in Manila, and she answered immediately, in the way that mothers and daughters answer late-night calls from parents they're quietly worried about. I told her what had happened. I tried to be matter-of-fact about it, and I wasn't. She listened without interrupting for a long time. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, I'm getting on a flight." I told her she didn't need to do that. She said, "I know I don't need to. I'm going to anyway." Sophie arrived 2 days later. She is very like her mother in the ways that matter: organized, precise, emotionally intelligent without performing it. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say, "I warned you." She sat with me in that apartment, and she helped me go through the financial picture, the transfers, what could and couldn't be traced. She contacted the British Embassy with me. We spoke to a legal consultant in Manila who told us, very gently but with no ambiguity, that the likelihood of recovering any portion of the transferred funds was extremely low. The accounts were clean. The business opportunity had been fictitious. The property documents had been convincing fabrications. The loan paperwork had been fabricated. Even the mother's dental treatment, he suspected, was a fiction, though that one was harder to establish. Sophie sat through all of this beside me without showing what she was feeling, which I knew was costing her something. On the third evening, after the practical conversations had been exhausted, she asked me how I was actually doing. Not financially. Actually. I told her I was having trouble trusting my own perception of events. She said she understood that. I said I had spent 6 months with a person and not seen what was right in front of me, and that I didn't know what that meant about me. She said it meant I was human, not foolish. I told her I wasn't sure I believed that. She said she was going to keep telling me until I did. Terence came to see me the week after Sophie left. He didn't say anything about being right. He poured 2 glasses of something and sat down and said, "Tell me." And I told him everything, not the summary version I'd given people, but the detailed version, the version where I admitted not just what she did, but every point at which I had felt doubt and chosen to override it. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "She targeted something real in you. That's the part that's hardest to make peace with." I asked him what he meant. He said, "She didn't invent your loneliness. She didn't invent your capacity for affection. Those things were real. She just found them and used them." I sat with that for a long time after he said it. I still sit with it. The anger arrived about 3 weeks after the restaurant. It came suddenly, on a Tuesday morning when I was making coffee, and I looked at the balcony where we used to sit, and it simply hit me, a white, clear, completely reasonable rage at the specific calculation of it. Not just the money, the performance, the months of it. The conversations about Margaret, where she had sat and looked sad and said she was sorry for my loss, and I had found comfort in her sympathy, and she had been composing messages to Rochelle in her head. The Sunday afternoons on the balcony, the food she cooked, the documentary questions about the tutors, All of it, every moment that I had experienced as genuine, had been resourced, had been deployed, had served a function that I was not aware I was participating in. That anger was clean in a way the vertigo hadn't been. I let it run for a while. I didn't do anything with it, didn't contact her, didn't try to find her, didn't pursue things the legal consultant had already told me were not worth pursuing. But I let it be there because it was honest, and it was honest in a way that the previous 6 months had not been. It told me the truth about what had happened, and the truth, even when it's ugly, is less disorienting than a beautiful lie. Sophie called every few days. She is careful not to hover, but careful enough that I know she is there. She sent me a book once, nothing to do with any of this, just a history of something she thought I'd find interesting, with a note that said for the evenings. That note meant more to me than she probably knew when she wrote it. It meant she was not treating me as a damaged person. She was treating me as her father, who had always read in the evenings and would do so again. I've spoken to 2 other British men in Manila since then, expats who had been here longer than me, who knew the landscape of this city in a way I had not when I arrived. Both of them, when I told them the broad shape of what had happened, were not surprised. One of them said something that I've thought about since. The thing you have to understand is that for some people in some situations, this is survival. That doesn't make it right. But it means she wasn't acting from hatred. She was acting from something much more ordinary than that. I don't know if that makes it easier or harder to carry. Some days it makes it easier. Some days the ordinariness of it, the fact that I was a strategy rather than a person, is exactly the part that hurts most. I am still in Manila. That surprises people, including Sophie initially, though she has come to understand it. Going back to London would mean going back to the flat in Kensington and the wine club and the cleaner who comes Tuesdays and the absence of Margaret and the structure of retirement that I hadn't found a way to live inside comfortably before I came here. Here at least there is a city that continues indifferently around me, which has its own strange comfort. I've changed where I spend my time. I don't go to bars. I've found a small restaurant near the apartment where the food is good and the owner is a man about my age, who lost his wife some years ago and who sits with me sometimes in the late afternoon when business is slow and talks about nothing in particular, which is its own form of company. Terence and I have lunch every week now. He doesn't treat me as a man who made a spectacular error. He treats me as a man who had an expensive year, which is the version of events I am working on accepting. He talks about other things, things happening in the city, things he's reading, things about his life before Manila. He doesn't talk about Bella. I appreciate that discipline. It would be easy and probably understandable to make her the defining center of every conversation, and I don't want that. I don't want her to take up that much of the remaining space. The financial picture is not as catastrophic as it felt that night in the restaurant, and also not as recoverable as I'd like. £220,000 from a retirement fund that was not infinite to begin with represents a significant reduction in what I'd planned to live on. Sophie and I have been through the numbers honestly and carefully, and the honest answer is that my life going forward will be smaller than I'd intended. Not desperate, I'm not in a desperate position, and I am aware that is itself a form of luck, but smaller. The flat in Kensington will likely need to be sold at some point to maintain liquidity. The trip to New Zealand I'd been vaguely planning is gone. The sense of financial ease that I'd spent 40 years constructing that security of knowing the numbers added up comfortably, that is gone, and I miss it in the way you miss something that you didn't know you were relying on until it wasn't there. What I've had to work hardest on is the thing Terence identified that evening, the perception question. The fact that for 6 months I looked at a performance and called it reality. I've gone through it many times, looking for the moments I should have seen it, and there are several. The 2-hour silence on a Tuesday, the bar smell on a Thursday evening, the muted weekend in the province, the slight glibness in some of her answers when I asked about the financial situations, a smoothness that I registered and explained away. I didn't miss these things. I noticed them, and I chose, each time, not to follow the noticing to its conclusion. That is a different and in some ways more uncomfortable thing than being simply blind. I've come to think that what she found in me wasn't stupidity. I want to be precise about this because the distinction matters. She found a man who was lonely in a specific way, not the lonely of having no one, but the lonely of having lost a particular person who had been the center of his life, and of being 73 years old in a world that doesn't design itself around 73-year-old men who are looking for connection. She found a man who had enough self-awareness to know he was being managed in his professional life, but not enough emotional awareness to recognize the same thing being done in his personal one. She found a man who had spent 40 years being useful and competent and in command of things, and who, in retirement, had lost that definition of himself and was therefore disproportionately vulnerable to anyone who offered him a new one. She found all of that, and she worked it with a patience and a consistency that, in a different application entirely, would have been genuinely impressive. I don't say that to give her credit she doesn't deserve. I say it because the alternative, the version where I was simply a foolish old man who didn't know better, is both less accurate and less useful. What happened to me could happen to anyone who carries what I carried and met what I met. The loneliness was real. The capacity for affection was real. The hunger for connection after years of grief and years of functional but not fulfilling retirement, all of that was real. She found real things, and she used them. And the lesson, if there is one that I can extract without it becoming a counsel of permanent suspicion, is not to stop having those real things. It is to hold them more carefully, to give them to people who have earned them rather than people who have simply identified them. Sophie is coming in 3 weeks. She's bringing the children, my grandchildren, whom I see less than I should, given that Edinburgh feels further away from Manila than it does from London. She'll stay for 10 days. I found a place near the water where I'm told children enjoy themselves, and I'm looking forward to it in the uncomplicated way that grandchildren produce, which cuts through a great deal of complicated adult unhappiness like a very clean knife. I'm going to let that be simple. I'm not going to spend that 10 days processing what happened in the past year. I'm going to be their grandfather, which is the thing I know how to be without any of the ambiguity that has characterized the last 14 months. What I know about myself now that I didn't know at the beginning of all this is not comfortable knowledge, but it is knowledge. I know the precise geography of my own vulnerability, where it lives, what it looks like from the outside to someone who knows how to find it. I know that the things about me that made me susceptible were not weaknesses in the ordinary sense of that word. They were the leftovers of a real life, fully lived, a grief that came from real love, a need for connection that came from having had it and lost it, a generosity that came from having worked hard for a long time and wanting to share what that work had produced. Bella found those things because they were there. They were visible. They were, in the end, the most honest parts of me. I'm not going to eliminate them. That would be the wrong lesson to take. A man of 74 who closes himself off from affection and trust in order to protect himself from the consequences of affection and trust is not a safe man. He is just a diminished one. And I've spent enough years being reduced by grief, by the loss of the professional self that retirement removed, by the particular narrowing that happens to men who don't find their shape in the years after work to choose reduction voluntarily now. What I can do is be less afraid of the questions I didn't ask, less afraid of looking at a situation clearly because looking might cost me something comfortable. The self-editing I did for 6 months, the moments I felt doubt and suppressed it because the doubt was inconvenient, that is the thing I want to undo, not the capacity for trust. The habit of editing myself out of my own better judgment in order to protect a feeling I'd decided I needed. 220,000 pounds. 6 months. A woman who sat across from me in a restaurant and laughed, openly and without apology, at the performance she had maintained for every moment of those 6 months. I think about that laughter sometimes and I try to understand it, what she got from it, what made it worth the moment of honesty after the months of dishonesty. I've decided I probably can't understand it. The inner world of a person who is capable of that is genuinely foreign to me, and maybe that foreignness, that complete failure of empathy in her direction, is actually the appropriate response. I don't need to understand her. I needed to see her clearly, and I didn't, and now I do, and that is going to have to be enough. The man I was when I arrived in Manila 14 months ago is not the man sitting in this chair writing this down. He was less defended and more foolish and more available and more capable of being swept away by something that looked like what he wanted. Some of that has been calcified by what happened, and I accept that some calcification was necessary, and some of it is probably a loss I'll only understand later. But some of it, the availability, the capacity, the hunger for something real, some of that I'm choosing to keep. Not because I'm going to walk into another bar and hand my heart and my savings to the next person who listens well, but because the alternative is to arrive at the end of whatever time I have left as a man who learned the wrong lesson from a painful year and spent the remainder of his life proving it. Sophie will be here in 3 weeks. The children will run through whatever space they're given and need things from me that have nothing to do with money or performance or the long and complicated story of the last 14 months. They'll need me to pay attention and to be present and to find the patience that grandchildren are very good at producing in people who have temporarily mislaid it. I can do that I know how to do. The rest I'm still working out. At 74, in a city that doesn't care who I used to be, with a financial situation that is smaller than I planned and a self-understanding that is larger than I had before, I'm still working it out. It doesn't feel like a satisfying place to end, but it's an honest one. And after 6 months of living inside a lie I mistook for the truth, honest is the only thing I'm interested in anymore. There is a version of this story where I never went back to that bar after the first night, where I had the drink with Terrence, found the conversation pleasant and nothing more, and moved on to spending 3 weeks in Manila, seeing temples and eating street food and flying home to the flat in Kensington with nothing more significant than a mild sunburn and a new appreciation for tamarind. That version exists. It was available to me. I made different choices at every junction that led away from it, and those choices were mine, and I have had to be honest with myself about what drove them. The truth is that by the time I met Bella, I had been running on empty for longer than I admitted to anyone, including Sophie. Not financially. Financially, I was stable, more than stable. Empty in the way that takes longer to identify because it hides under the surface of a perfectly functional life. I had a routine. The flat was well maintained. I ate properly. I exercised. I kept up with the news and with a small number of friendships that had survived the transition from professional to personal acquaintance. From the outside, the picture was a man managing retirement with competence and dignity. From the inside, it was a man going through very precisely calibrated motions while experiencing something closer to a low-grade numbness that he had learned to call contentment, because contentment required less from him than the truth. Margaret's death had done something to my capacity for engagement that I had never fully admitted. She had been the person I brought things to, the experiences, the small daily absurdities, the ideas I wanted to think through out loud. Without her, there was nowhere to bring anything. Not because I lacked other people. I had Sophie. I had the remnants of a professional social world. I had Terrence, but because the particular quality of being known by one person completely, over decades, is not something that can be replicated by a number of less complete knowings. I had been half of something for 31 years. Then I was a whole something, entirely alone, and I had never found a way to be comfortable in that shape. When Bella listened to me, when she asked the follow-up questions, when she remembered the details, when she sat on the balcony and gave the impression of a person who genuinely wanted to know what was inside my head, she was delivering precisely and exactly what I had been starving for. Not because she had studied me and identified the need. I think, or I've come to think, that she was simply good at finding what men needed and reflecting it back to them. And what I needed was so obvious and so present in everything I said and did that it would have been visible to anyone paying moderate attention. This is the thing about being a mark, and I use that word now, though I could not have used it 6 months ago. The thing about being a mark is that it doesn't require you to be unusual in your vulnerability. It requires you to be human in a very ordinary way and to have encountered someone whose particular skill is the exploitation of ordinary human needs. I was not uniquely foolish. I was simply available in the ways that she had learned to recognize. There was a conversation in the 4th month that I've returned to many times. We were on the balcony, a Sunday evening, the city doing its Sunday thing below us. She asked me to describe what my marriage had been like, not the facts of it. She already had those, but the texture of it, the daily quality of it. I talked for a long time. I talked about Margaret's laugh, which was specific and recognizable from across a room. I talked about the habit we had of reading the newspapers together on Saturday mornings, not discussing them, just occupying the same space with the same activity, which sounds unremarkable but which produced a quality of companionship that I have not found language for. I talked about the way she argued, precise, patient, always willing to change her position if the evidence warranted it, which was rarer than it sounds and which I had admired enormously. I talked about the shape of the loss, which was not the sharp grief of early bereavement, but the ongoing, low-register grief of a man who keeps reaching for a conversation partner who is no longer there. Bella listened to all of this with what looked like genuine feeling. She said very little. At one point she reached across and put her hand over mine on the table and didn't move it for a while. I found that gesture very comforting. I found it comforting for weeks afterward, returning to it when I needed to. The message thread on her phone, that night in the restaurant, contained a message about that specific conversation. Had to sit through dead wife stuff again tonight. Nearly an hour. Nodded and looked sad the whole time. He talks so much. And Rochelle's response? Worth it though? And Bella? Obviously yes. He's so soft when he talks about her. Easy to work after. I read that exchange 3 times in the restaurant. I needed to read it 3 times before I believed I was reading what I was reading. The hand on mine on the balcony, the quality of stillness she had brought to that hour of my talking, the expression on her face that I had categorized as empathy, all of it had been deployed. The grief I had shared had been the instrument, not the recipient of the comfort. She had used Margaret, or more precisely, she had used my grief about Margaret as a tool for softening me. That is the part I have found most difficult to contain in the 12 weeks since the restaurant. Not the money, the specific use of Margaret. I am a man who spent 40 years in professional environments where I understood manipulation as a business instrument. I watched it used in negotiations, in performance reviews, in boardroom politics. I thought I knew it when I saw it. What I didn't account for was the version of it that arrives in the register of intimacy rather than the register of business, that uses the language of care and warmth rather than the language of leverage. I was defended against one version and entirely open to the other. She found the gap and walked through it. 12 weeks after the restaurant. I'm still in Manila, but I've changed my geography within it. The service department in the Makati district felt contaminated in a way I couldn't reason with. Every corner of it carried some remnant of the 6 months, and I found I couldn't sit in the chair by the window or stand on the balcony without the images arriving. I moved to a smaller apartment on the other side of BGC, simpler and quieter. I brought less with me than I left behind. I left some things in the previous apartment that I simply did not want to carry, including a cardigan she had admired once and told me suited me, which I knew was irrational to leave behind, but left behind anyway. The new apartment has a small balcony that faces east rather than west. The view is of a street rather than the skyline, which is less dramatic and more honest, which suits me. In the mornings I have coffee out there and read the history Sophie sent, and then other books I've bought from an English language bookshop nearby that is run by a Filipino woman in her 60s who has excellent taste and strong opinions, and who I've come to value as the kind of acquaintance that has no history and no agenda. I've told her nothing about any of this. She knows me as a British man who reads history and arrives on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and sometimes asks for recommendations. That simplicity has its own restorative quality. I spoke to a counselor once, via a video call arranged through the British Embassy Support Service. I want to be honest about how I went into that conversation skeptically, with the residual reserve of a man of my generation and background who considers talking about feelings to a professional a slightly unusual thing to do. The counselor was direct and didn't dramatize anything, which I respected. She asked me what I was most struggling with, and I said it was the perception question, the trust in my own judgment that had been compromised. She said that was very common in these situations, and that the restoration of self-trust was a process rather than an event. She said something that has stayed with me, that the capacity to be deceived by someone skilled at deception is not the same as poor judgment, That distinguishing between them was important for what came next. I'm not sure I've fully made that distinction yet, but I know the difference she's pointing at. I'm working toward it. Terrence brings his own history to our weekly lunches in ways he doesn't always state directly, but which are legible between the lines. He moved to Cebu after a marriage that ended badly, not betrayal exactly, but a long, slow incompatibility that produced 2 decades of low-grade unhappiness before it was finally named and resolved. He came east to find something quieter and found it, but not without cost. He knows what it is to start over in the second half of a life. He doesn't offer wisdom about my specific situation because I haven't asked for it, and he knows I haven't asked for it. But his presence, the fact of a man my age who has navigated his own version of loss and arrived somewhere workable, is itself a kind of evidence that workable is a reachable destination. Sophie's children are 7 and 4. The 7-year-old, my granddaughter Clara, has her mother's precision and her grandfather's tendency to think out loud whether or not the thought is ready. The 4-year-old, James, has not yet developed any of those complications and simply requires attention and occasionally food and finds the world entirely satisfactory when those 2 things are provided. I am looking forward to being James for 10 days. I am looking forward to the uncomplicated requirements of someone for whom my net worth and my recent history and my complicated emotional situation are entirely irrelevant compared to whether I will get on the floor and help build whatever he's building. 220,000 pounds is a figure I am going to live with for a long time, not just as a number but as the shape it leaves in the practical landscape of whatever years remain. The plan to contribute to Clara and James's education in a meaningful way is now a smaller plan. The idea of splitting my time between Manila and somewhere in southern Europe, Portugal, perhaps, where the climate and cost of living had made it appealing, is no longer a real option. The flat in Kensington, when it's eventually sold, will provide some recovery, but the financial ease that I had worked toward and achieved over 4 decades is not something I can expect to have again. The mathematics of what's left don't produce that kind of ease. I've made my peace with that in a way that isn't entirely peace but is the version of peace available to me. I've learned to hold the number without it expanding to fill my entire field of vision. Some days it stays in its appropriate place, one part of a complicated picture, significant but not total. Some days it fills the room and I have to sit with that and wait for it to subside. Both of those things are honest responses to what happened, and I'm not trying to arrive at a place where only the first is true. What I find I want to say, if any of this has a point beyond the private therapy of writing it down, is something about the particular trap that awaits men in circumstances like mine. Not old men, specifically men who have reached a point in their lives where the professional self that organized everything has been removed, where the person who made a life meaningful is gone, and where the loneliness of that combined absence is so large and so present that the offer of relief from it, even when the offer comes with circumstances that should be examined more carefully, is almost irresistible. Bella didn't invent a need, she found one, and the need itself was not pathological. It was the absolutely ordinary human need of a person who had loved and lost and wanted to love again, placed in the hands of someone who understood how to use it. If there is advice in this, and I'm not sure there is, I'm not sure this is the kind of story that resolves into advice. It would be something like this. The loneliness is real. The need for connection is real. Going looking for both of those things, even imperfectly, even in places that carry risk, that is not the mistake. The mistake is editing yourself out of your own better judgment in order to protect the relief you've found. The moments of doubt that I overrode, one after another, for 6 months, those were not character failures. They were information I chose not to use. And the version of this story where I used them earlier would have cost me less, not in the sense of emotional safety, but in the sense of practical outcome. The feelings would have hurt either way. The 220,000 pounds was optional. I am 74 years old and I am still here. Still in a city that doesn't know who I used to be and doesn't particularly need to. Still having coffee on a balcony that faces east. Still reading on Tuesday and Thursday mornings in a bookshop where a woman with excellent taste and no knowledge of my recent history sells me things worth reading. Still having lunch with Terrence once a week in a place with good food and honest conversation. Still, despite everything, looking forward to something the arrival of Sophie and the children in 3 weeks, the 10 days of building things on floors and being exactly and only the thing I am to them, which requires nothing I don't already know how to give. That's not a triumphant ending. I know it isn't, but it's the true one, and the true one is the only kind I have any use for now.